Okay, we are starting. Nobody say anything embarrassing.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jamie Hughes, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the Implementation and Evaluation Using Your Logic Model to Guide Your Project webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to review a few administrative items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. I'd also like to mention that you have the audio option of using your mic and speakers and calling in, which can sometimes cause a little bit of feedback when you do ask a question during the question and answer period. So I'd also like to mention that there's an option for you to call back in with an 800 number if you'd like to use that as well. And if you have any issues with that or any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box or contact me at my email address that is listed on the invite if you have any issues with that. I'd also like to make sure and let all participants know that you should be able to hear the audio and view presentation slides whether you use the mic and speakers or you use the telephone option. And quickly, I'd like everyone to please turn your attention to the GoToWebinar attendees interface, which is made up of two parts. That's the viewer window on the left, which shows you the presentation slides. And you can see everything the presenter will share on their screen. And you'll also see the control panel on the right. And within the control panel is how you can participate in today's web event. By clicking the orange arrow that is found in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you can open and close your control panel. And to keep your control panel open or visible, I suggest checking the view menu and ensuring that the auto hide option is not selected on your screen. The chat feature, which is found in the bottom portion of the control panel, may be utilized at any point during this webinar. And this, like I said, is found at the bottom of the control panel. And this feature allows for you to interact with all of the webinar attendees. You simply type in your question or your comment in the chat field. You'll select whether or not you want to send to all attendees, and you click Send. You may also utilize the Raise Your Hand feature during the question and answer portion of the presentation. And by using that, you simply click on the raised hand icon that is found next to your attendee name. When questions are answered during that portion of the presentation, you'll simply raise your hand, click the Raise Your Hand feature, and your line will be unmuted for you to participate audibly during this presentation. We, of course, don't anticipate any issues with today's event, but if for any reason technical difficulties arise during this event and the audio and or screen views may be lost, please attempt to dial in and log back into this webinar through the original webinar invite you received. And if access is still unable to be regained, please check your email inbox for updates regarding rescheduling this webinar event. But we don't anticipate any issues happening today. And I'd like to welcome everyone, and we will now begin the webinar presentation. Thank you for attending.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Lori Palin at RTI, and I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar on using your logic model throughout your project from implementation through evaluation. First, I just wanted to remind everyone on the call today that the slides and a handout for this presentation were sent out in advance by email. If you did not receive those, please note that the slides, the audio recording from today, and the handout will all be posted on the Community of Practice website after this call. If you don't have Community of Practice access, your primary contact at your site should be able to hook you up with that. Click to change slides. Sorry, we're just having a little delay in changing slides.
Jamie, do you want to take this back to advanced slides since our computer is stuck? Jamie, are you there?
Actually, it looks like we've... Okay. Sorry. It looks
I'm
like
here if you'd like me to take over, but it looks like you've got it back in order.
See. Yeah, we'll see if we may, after the next slide, need you to take it over, but for now it looks like we've come unstuck, so thanks. Sorry, everybody. So first I wanted to mention that this presentation involved a collaboration between a lot of folks here at RTI, including Olivia Ashley, Mindy Herman-Stahl, Duran Banks, Mary Vance, and myself. But today you're going to be hearing from me as well as from Dr. Olivia Ashley. So on today's webinar, we're really going to be discussing using your logic model for guidance throughout your project. So during planning, during implementation, including to make mid-course corrections during implementation, and also during evaluation. We have 3 learning objectives for today. By the end of the webinar, we hope that folks will be able to identify benefits of revisiting your logic model at various stages of your project, that you'll be able to learn about steps for using your logic model at various stages in your project, and that you'll be able to use your logic model as a communication tool for evaluation. So I've projected our schedule for today. So right now we're going through some introductory information, and then I'll be talking with you about benefits of using and revisiting your logic model throughout your project. Then I will turn it over to Olivia, who will talk about using your logic model for planning and implementation startup, as well as using your logic model for mid-course corrections. Then I'll take things back over to talk about using your logic model as an evaluation communication tool. Each of these segments is going to have time for questions and also chances to share any experiences or advice you may have as grantees. I did want to acknowledge that we likely have a wide variety of expertise from individuals participating today. So there may be some of you on the phone today who have maybe just developed a logic model or two, and that's about it. And there may be those of you on the call who have developed lots of logic models, and you've used them consistently over the course of lots of projects. So there's material here for everyone. For those of you who are less experienced, we hope that you'll ask lots of questions through the chat feature or by phone. And also, if you've gotten to this end of the webinar and would like some more assistance, you're welcome to request technical assistance through your project officer. For those of you who are more experienced, there is advanced material in this presentation for you. So we hope that you'll be patient during some of the slides that may be more review or background. And then when you have the opportunity, we'd love to have you share some of the experience and some of the expertise that you have around these topics. So at the beginning of the call, Jamie briefly touched on our interactive options for today. I'm going to just touch back on them one more time. So we're going to have polling, and we'll have a poll in just a minute. That will pop up in the center of your screen, and you'll have a chance to vote on a question that we share. There is also a chat box at your right. We encourage you to use this to send questions either to us or to the group as a whole. And this is also a place where everyone can share answers to questions that are posed, share ideas, and share comments about the things that we're talking about. And don't feel like you have to wait till designated times to do that. You're welcome to use that box throughout the presentation. And then again, also, we can take questions and comments by phone. Again, in the box at your right, if you just raise your hand, and if we have an opportunity, we'll stop and open things up for questions by phone. So, much anticipated, let's go ahead and share that poll that I mentioned. Okay, so the poll should now be appearing in the center of your screen. So we'd like to learn about your experience with using logic models on your project. So you have 4 options here to talk about whether you've used logic models around project planning, implementation, evaluation, or some combination of those various uses. So we'll leave the poll open for a few minutes and let folks select the answer that best describes your experience with logic models. Okay, so it looks like just about everyone's voted. We're going to give you just a few more seconds to cast your vote if you haven't. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close the poll now. Okay, so here are the results of what you told us. So it looks like there are very few folks on the call who have just used their logic model for grant writing. And if that is you, that's totally okay. We hope you'll have some material here that will be useful. But it looks like a lot of folks have used their logic model for things like project planning, implementation startup, and evaluation planning. So hopefully there'll be some more advanced information about how to continue to use your logic model for those great functions. But also, if you have experiences that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear about them to enhance our presentation today. So with that, okay, so we're going to go ahead and proceed and talk about the benefits of using and revisiting a logic model throughout your project. So projects often field a lot of questions from stakeholders. This can be everybody from your boss to leadership of particular agencies or schools in your community that are involved with your project. These people could be public officials, they could be parents of kids you're involving in your project, or anyone who's providing resources to your project. And they can ask you a lot of questions. Some of the ones you may hear are things like, how is your project different from what's already going on in our community? What resources do you need from me, or what resources do we need to solicit in general? And how are we going to know if our project is working once we've completed implementation? So one benefit of using your logic model throughout your project is you can be able to respond to these questions. So we're going to go through all the questions that were listed on the previous slide and just touch on a few of them. But if there are questions that I skipped that you really want to hear more about or dialogue about, I encourage you to use the chat box to talk about those. So one question you may get from stakeholders is, how is this project different from other things that are going on in our community? So you can use your logic model and look at the pieces of it and talk about how this is different from the initiatives that are already in your community. If you're a prep project, maybe you're the only project in your community that's addressing adulthood preparation subjects. Maybe you're the only program in your community using evidence-based approaches. Or maybe you're the only one addressing a particular high-need target population. So all of those things could be identified through your logic model. Your stakeholders may ask you, what resources will it take to get this project off the ground and keep it running? So your logic model should show things like the costs, materials, people, time, training, spaces involved in carrying out your project. You may hear questions about, are we reaching the right people? So this is where you can examine the outputs box in your logic model and look at what that says about who will be reached and compare that to what's spelled out, for example, in your program plan. Your stakeholders may ask you, okay, how are we going to get to the outcomes that we want to see? So this is about, in your logic model, that link, the arrow between risk and protective factors and behavior change. Some people also call these, for example, short-term and long-term outcomes. But this is where you can explain that this link is how you're going to get to behavior change. So for example, maybe your project is looking to change teens' attitudes about sexual behavior. And this is something that will lead to delayed initiation of sex. So that would be spelled out in your logic model. Stakeholders may ask you, why is your project going to work when maybe other projects in your community have not been as successful or not accomplished everything they wanted to? So this sort of ties back to question 1 on the previous slide about what makes your project unique. So you can compare your logic model to the logic model or project activities of other initiatives in your community and talk about what's different, and that hopefully these things that are different will be what contributes to your project's success. Then on this slide, a lot of these questions are about evaluation, and we're going to talk a lot more about evaluation later, so I'm going to skip over those for now, but again, feel free to chime in with questions. But I did want to underscore question 9, which is about sustainability. How can we capitalize on the initial successes of this project? So this is where you can ask questions about each logic model component to answer that question about how you may move forward. So you could ask, could the same activities that you did be done in other schools or with other age groups? Are the same resources available for those new groups or in different settings? Are the activities and the risk and protective factors you targeted, are those appropriate for new groups? Maybe those activities are or are not appropriate, for example, for younger kids than you targeted or older kids that you targeted. And you have to think about whether these activities and risk and protective factors are relevant for new settings where maybe the culture around sexuality is different from the setting that you're currently working in. But again, your logic model gives you a way to think about how you might translate your project to new endeavors. So another benefit of using a logic model throughout your project is it can serve as a communication tool. So logic models can convey a lot of information in a fairly small amount of space, especially if your logic model is, let's say, limited to a page. It's a really concise visual representation of a lot of different things that are going on, a lot of elements and how they work together. This makes communication hopefully really clear and relatively quick, as opposed to having to talk through your entire project from front to back or having someone read a very long narrative implementation plan. Also, your logic model can be a tool for project marketing. So maybe it's how you recruit stakeholders or resources to your project. Also, it can be used for future marketing efforts to engage new supporters. For example, you might use your logic model to write a future grant to fund your project once your current funding ends. And that's one reason why it's really important for your logic model to be a living document and to update it in the face of any new changes to the way you're going about your project. That way it is really current and accurate as you're moving forward and as you're trying to expand your efforts later on. Also, a logic model allows stakeholders to focus on the elements that are important to them without losing sight of the bigger picture. So for example, let's say that your project has one set of activities that are geared towards teens and one set of activities geared towards parents. Well, you may have folks that are only involved in one or the other. So you may have implementers that are only delivering to teens or stakeholders that are only giving you resources for your parent activities. So this allows each of those individuals to see, okay, where am I? And let me focus on what I do, but also helps them to not forget that they are part of a bigger picture and to continue to think about how they fit in. Also, again, as we've touched on a little bit, your logic model can give answers to a lot of different questions, and in particular, why this project or what makes this project unique. So when you're using your logic model as a communication tool, it can show you a lot of things. It can show you what resources you need. It can show you who you expect to provide these resources, and that's something we grapple with a lot here at RTI with our school-based research or school-based projects, is when we're doing things in schools, there's a lot of folks that we have to get on board. We have to get school district personnel on board, school principals, and also champions within each school. So your logic model is going to show who those important people are. Your logic model is also going to show what changes or outcomes those stakeholders can expect to see throughout your project. Also, your logic model is going to give a common framework or language to the various concepts within your project. So a lot of projects targeting teens are going to bring together a multidisciplinary team. For example, there may be folks on your team from medicine or public health. There may be folks from the policy world, from the social sciences, from statistics, and a lot of those folks can use different language for the same thing. So are you talking about moderators versus subpopulations? Are you talking about mediators versus short-term outcomes versus risk and protective factors? So this gives everyone to get a chance to get on the same page and know that they're talking about the same thing. And again, because the logic model shows a process, it gives a roadmap for when and how stakeholders can expect to see results from the project. So you may expect to see process evaluation results or your inputs and outputs before you see your short-term and long-term outcome evaluation results. So once you have everyone on the same page, your logic model is going to allow you to discuss some different issues. It's going to allow you to refine your mission, goals, and objectives, so to talk about the kinds of people you should be targeting. It's going to allow you to talk about the kinds of behaviors that are important for your project. It's going to be able to allow you to talk about, are we going about things the right way? And it's going to allow you to talk about what other resources you may need to get moving forward. So now we'd like to go ahead and hear from you. So lots of folks in our poll mentioned they've used their logic model throughout their project. So we'd like to hear some examples of how you have shared your logic model during project planning. Maybe you used it to get a community partner on board. Maybe you used it to communicate your goals to an influential stakeholder. Maybe you used it to get resources, or maybe you used it to get staff buy-in. So if you could please use your chat window and reflect on some of those things you've done, and then we'll discuss that in a minute. Okay, so it looks like so far we haven't seen any chats yet. So we're going to go ahead and share some ideas, and maybe that. Oh, we do see. I see a hand. So Jamie, would you be able to open up the line for Peg Gavin, please?
Shoot.
Okay,
Hello?
Peg. Here. Hi, Peg.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I see the chat box, but I'm not able to enter any text into it, so that might be a problem other people are having as well.
Well, it looks like raise your hand function is working.
Yeah.
So if folks are unable to type in chat, feel free to raise your hand. We'd love to hear you talk. If you can't type to us, it's okay.
So Peg, while we have you on the line, do you have any thoughts about our question? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. In working with other projects, not necessarily on this one yet, but we have definitely used logic models as a way to engage staff who were providing direct services to help them get the bigger picture of the project beyond just what they were doing. And then also engaging with community partners who were participating in a collaboration. So it's been very helpful there. I've not thought about doing it to communicate with stakeholders, but that's certainly an interesting idea. I mean, and I guess I'm thinking stakeholders in terms of people that might be interested in providing some funding down the road.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have thoughts or things you'd like to build on? And thank you, Peg, for that response.
Sure.
Does anyone else have thoughts on how they'd like to possibly use logic models for their project, or how you have used them in the past? All right, well, if things come up that you'd like to share as we go along, feel free to raise your hand. Again, it sounds like the chat box may not be working, but that is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. And hopefully you should be able to share comments with the whole audience. But again, feel free to raise your hand as well. Okay. So another benefit for using a logic model is it can give you a roadmap for how all activities in your project fit together. For example, you're going to have lots of pieces of your intervention. It shows how they may fit together. For example, perhaps you're doing a parent night to enhance your youth strategies. So that can show why your parent night is, for example, important for recruiting and retaining youth in your program, and how it may enhance parent-child communication, which may be one of the outcomes you're targeting as part of your project. It will show how facilitator training fits in and why that's important. It can also show how progress on your project and how outcomes will be communicated. Okay, another benefit from using a logic model is that it can define what you're going to accomplish with implementation and with evaluation. So what you should be gauging your evaluation against. It's going to show things like how many sessions are you hoping to implement, who will those participants be, what resources do you need, who is going to provide those resources, and when. And I did want to just add a disclaimer that your logic model shows what should happen during your project, but as we all know, sometimes things in the real world don't always turn out as we planned. So again, a process evaluation can show whether what happened in actuality with your project lines up with what you were intending with your logic model. Another benefit of using a logic model is that it helps you interpret evaluation results. So let's say your evaluation shows what you expected, which is that your project is arousing success with your target population. So your logic model can show how you reach those goals. It can show you what resources, inputs, outputs, and risk and protective factors were important. If you have this represented in your logic model, it can show you can test whether your outcomes were the same for all participants or whether there were some participants who saw more benefits than others. And also, it can show you if all of the project inputs and resources were actually necessary. So again, sometimes implementation in the real world is different from what we planned. So let's say there's a particular activity that you intended to implement that didn't happen, or a particular resource that you wanted to get but didn't. If your project is still successful in the face of those missing pieces, that can show you that maybe those aren't essential for future implementations. Okay, so let's say the opposite happens and your evaluation does not show what you expect in terms of program outcomes. You can revisit the logic model to try and figure out why. So essentially, were all of the pieces in the logic model there, and did they happen in the right order? Did you reach who you intended to? Was implementation, did that happen with fidelity? Were there resources missing? And also, the last bullet has to do with measurement. So did you measure everything the way your logic model suggested you should? For example, let's say the outcome you decided to measure was delayed initiation of sexual intercourse. And let's say that your target population is 6th graders. Well, the initiation rates of sexual intercourse are pretty low for that age group. So that suggests that maybe you didn't see results because there's not much of that behavior going on in the general population. And so maybe you can conceptualize different ways to measure that you may be able to see program results later on. Okay, so we've shared a lot of information so far about the benefits of using your logic model throughout your project. So we wanted to ask first, now that you've heard this information, who at your project site do you think needs to hear about this information, about what we've shared so far? And again, you can either raise your hand to share or type it in the chat box if the chat box is indeed working. So is there anyone in your project who should hear everything that we've talked about so far? Sure. So we're going to brainstorm around the table and get some folks started. Oh, yeah, I think that's just feedback. Oh, I see a hand. Let me see. So it looks like Elise, we have you unmuted and ready to share.
Okay, thank you. I guess I just have a different caveat I wanted to bring into the picture. We serve the entire state of Indiana, and so I guess you know, in thinking of a logic model, a lot of times when we set forth to implement something like this, it's very hard to culturally contextualize or make indigenous to what our counties need. I mean, for example, you know, when I try to communicate something to one county, I mean, it's just not applicable to the next county over. So we have urban areas, rural, just all different. So how do you sort of streamline something to contextualize it where I just feel like they just sort of roll their eyes whenever, you know, I begin to implement something from the capital of Indiana because they just don't think I understand their culture and their specific county.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a common challenge. My suggestion, I can throw it out, we have some other folks at the table, is maybe if it would be possible to tailor a logic model for each of the sites and to have a core logic model that applies to your entire state project, but to work in some local resources or local context into versions for each of the individual sites that you're working with.
Elise, this is Olivia. We've taken a core logic model like Lori's described to lots of different counties. North Carolina has 100 counties, and they may be a little more homogeneous than in Indiana because we don't have quite as many metropolitan areas here. But we've had that same issue, that there are issues out west where there's not a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, and a lot of issues down east where there's a lot of poverty and rural issues, and then a lot of issues along our 95 Beltway with lots of drug trafficking and STIs and very high-risk populations there. And what we've done is make sure that we understand the community that we're walking into and highlight the part of the logic model that is the most meaningful for them. So the whole thing may not come together for them. All parts of the logic model may not create buy-in, but we make sure that there is something there for the community that we are talking to and that they're buying into that one piece. And of course, our project activities are covering all of the activities that are in the logic model, but we're trying, when we're communicating with those community stakeholders, to make sure that they see the part of that that reflects them. I don't know if that's helpful for you, Elise.
So does anyone else have any thoughts to share on Elisa's issue of making a logic model culturally relevant for lots of subpopulations? Or anything else you'd like to share, any challenges that you've had? Does anyone have any thoughts to share on how to keep a logic model sort of top of mind over the course of your project? Anything that you've done to keep it on your team's radar throughout the course of your project? Are there any folks who, let's say, bring their logic models to project meetings or revisit it on a regular schedule? Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So in sum, your logic model can be used at all phases of your project, from planning through evaluation. It can be used as a communication and planning tool. It's an easy way to communicate quickly and clearly about your project. Your logic model should integrate all of the components of your project. So that's curricula you're using, but also any components you may have added that are unique to your project. And also, your logic model should guide changes in response to any challenges or unexpected evaluation results. Now I'm going to turn things over to Olivia, who's going to talk a little bit more about using your logic model for planning and startup.
Thanks, Lori. All right, so I'm Olivia Ashley. I work with Lori at RTI International in Raleigh, North Carolina. And you may have seen our names on lots of email messages about TA that you may be receiving, or training opportunities, or training deliverables like this webinar. I'm sad that our chat function may not be working, and I'm wondering if we could just do a quick test. For anyone, can everyone try to type into chat? Let's just see if it's working. If you can just write test or it's working or help me or something so that we can just see for whom chat may be working, because we've found that grantees get a lot of benefit from chatting with each other as we're talking about ideas that they have or questions and answering each other's questions. We were able to type in, "Hi everyone, please share experiences here." I hope everybody could see that. So if you could, in the lower right-hand corner, there's a chat box. If you could put your cursor in the box and just type something, hello, and hit return, and make sure it's on all entire audience. It would be helpful for us to see if it's working for anyone.
Oh, something popped up.
Jamie says, hopefully all attendees can participate in this event. So it's working for Jamie and it's working for RTI. So Jamie, it looks like perhaps the chat box is not working for us today. It might be something for us to look into for future webinars. And so what that means is if
somebody came through, Wendy got a test.
We got something from Wendy Houston. All right, it's working for at least one person. Wendy, we might be leaning on you heavily if we can't get anybody else's chat box to work. All right, for folks who are not able to get through on chat, please feel free at any point to hit the raise your hand button. And that is in the attendee box where you click beside your name under the raise your hand column. We'll be glad to stop and take any questions or comments. And we have some opportunities where we'll open the phone lines to see if folks have things they want to say as well. All right, so Lori's talked specifically about some benefits of using your logic model throughout your project. And now we're going to talk about specific time points and steps for using your logic model at each time point. So the first time point is planning and implementation startup. So your logic model can inform implementation planning by mapping to inputs to document your plan for eliciting, for example, donations or other resources, hiring or staffing or supervision, partnerships with other organizations in your community, and staff training. The logic model can be really useful for documenting all of this in a visual presentation to make sure everyone is on the same page and has a common understanding during project planning. And I believe it was Peg who said that she had not used this for stakeholders before. We found that logic models can be so much more pleasing for folks who don't have a lot of time to read. They may not be able to read our entire grant application cover to cover, even though we thought it was the most beautiful thing we'd ever written. But they do have time to look at a one-page logic model and spend just a few minutes talking with us about how A links to B links to C. So it's just a really quick, efficient, time-saving way to get information across. The logic model can also help to create a shared vision about your specific strategies, such as the curriculum that you've selected and how to make sure that everyone that sees your logic model understands your curriculum selection, how you're planning to involve parents, any media venues that you might be deciding that you want to use to promote your messages, where implementation is going to occur, and who you're going to recruit into your project. The logic model also provides opportunities to document during planning the outputs you want to achieve. For example, the number of schools that you want to serve, the number of youths you plan to serve, how many hours each youth is going to receive your project activities, the number of media messages or other activities you're going to deliver. And as your team agrees on the outputs that will be in your logic model, it's also a good idea to start discussing how you're going to document these outputs or assess when they are actually occurring. So, for example, are you planning on using program staff written reports or fidelity monitoring logs to document or assess that these outputs occurred? Are you planning on looking at school schedules to say, here's documentation that the curriculum or our project activities are occurring on the schedule? Are you using observations or something else to assess whether the outputs occurred as you planned? Your logic model should also succinctly identify the constructs that you're targeting and hope to measure. For example, your risk and protective factors and intentions and or behaviors that you want to target. And you can see in the example in the box on the left There are theoretical constructs here that came from the theory of reasoned action or theory of planned behavior. You can see intent to delay sexual initiation. That whole theory is about how intention leads to behavior. And the first two look to me like health belief model, perceived risks and perceived harm. And those types of messages are in that type of a theory. And I also see self-efficacy at the bottom. So the logic model helps to make sure that everyone's on the same page about the expected outcomes from the project, and particularly how theory may be informing your project activities and how those are going to link up with the outcomes that you're expecting to see. We always use the logic model when we're training frontline staff. We found that the logic model is really useful as a very simple illustration of the project to get staff buy-in. It helps staff to understand what is going to happen and how things are going to roll out in this project and where they fit in, because they may not be the only project activity that is going on. They may be delivering a curriculum, but there may be lots of other things that are happening, and they can see how they fit in. And it also helps them get a shared vision and understand how all the components work together. It also helps staff to understand which risk and protective factors we're targeting and how those factors are supposed to lead to the desired outcomes. I'm sure everybody has experienced staff turnover, whether it's on this project or at some other time. And when we've had it happen on our projects, we've used our logic model as a really important resource to get new staff up to speed quickly about all the components of the project and how they work together. So it's been a really easy way for folks to learn about the project, and we found that they can articulate pretty clearly with those visual cues rather than, as I said, reading an entire grant application and trying to memorize all the components there. When I was getting training about how to do training of trainers and how to bring staff on board for a project intervention, I was always trained that the staff's understanding the rationale and the theory of the project was more important than any specific activity or piece of information they learn, because if the staff understand the theoretical framework, they will have this as their basis when they're responding to any random thing that may happen when they're delivering program. So for instance, there may be questions or occurrences that we could never anticipate, and they can't anticipate, and the curriculum can't spell all of those out. But if they are using the theoretical framework of the project and understand what we're trying to accomplish, what the risk and protective factors are that we're trying to target, then they have some way of making those decisions when things happen that are unexpected. So for example, if an intervention is based on, say, health belief model, we saw that in one of the previous slides, that's focused on perceived social and psychological risks associated with sexual activity and perceived harm from sexually transmitted infections, and the staff encounter a novel situation, and I'm sure you can imagine lots of novel situations that happen when you get teenagers together. We've heard questions that we were not anticipating sometimes about how families in different cultures might perceive dating relationships, and kids really want to talk about that sometimes. They also, you may have a group that doesn't understand the instructions for an activity exactly the way that they're supposed to do it, or there may be a group discussion that begins to veer off course. You have kids who are extremely engaged, but they're not talking about exactly what you thought that this activity would be about. Understanding the theoretical framework helps the staff bring the conversation back into what the constructs are that are supposed to be targeted. So for instance, if any of those things happen, the staff can focus on bringing the conversation back to how teens' relationships with their partners, their peers, and adults they care about may be affected by their being sexually active, whether they are psychologically ready for a sexual relationship at their young age and all the complicated feelings that may come with that, and how harmful they may feel that sexually transmitted infections can be to their health and well-being. So as long as the staff understand that underlying basis, when these other things come up, they have a frame of reference to come back to what they need to focus on. Okay, so we want to hear from you. It sounds like we may hear from Wendy by chat and everybody else by raising their hand. We're wondering if anyone can share examples of how they've used their logic model during planning, after award, or during startup, and what ideas you might have now. So please either type in your chat or raise your hand, because we really want to hear from you, and we want your peers to hear from you. It's pretty important that folks hear what other grantees are doing, because it may be really helpful to other folks on the phone. While we're waiting for folks to chime, oh, I see Peg is chiming in. Okay, Jamie, can you let Peg have the microphone?
Hey, Peg, it looks like your line is open.
Hello again. And yeah, I'm still not able to enter in the chat box. I mean, I think that using the logic model during the planning, just in conceptualizing the whole application and pulling together partners to develop the initial vision of what we think we could be doing in the project has always been pretty critical, and a good way of getting people on board. And then it always feels like there's such a gap between when you apply for funding and when you get funding, and sometimes you sort of lose sight of, okay, what did we say we were going to do? And so then that's been an easy way to just kind of quickly go back to what that original vision was and see, okay, now that funding's in place and we're dealing with the realities of implementing what we said that we were going to do, how does this stand up? So I've found that to be really a great tool for bringing people together just in the process of developing an application, but then again, a good way of getting us sort of re-engaged in that startup phase and back on track with what we were thinking about 5 or 6 months ago.
Peg, this is Olivia. We've had exactly the same situation here. We've written a grant, and then there's a waiting period after that. And we may have had some insights now that we've had the chance to think about it, or things may have changed. And we may have gotten comments on our proposal as well that helped us understand things that we needed to improve. And so one of the first things we do is pull out the logic model to see, do we need to amend that and improve it, or just to refresh ourselves on what did we say we're going to do here, and is this the best approach still?
Right.
When you said that you're pulling your partners together, do you all create a logic model together, or is this where you're having a discussion and then your agency is responsible for pulling the logic model together?
I've worked on it in different capacities as both the agency submitting an application and as a partner on somebody else's proposal. So I've seen it done both ways. Typically, if I'm submitting the application, then the input from people, I sort of consolidate all that and put it into a logic model. But it's definitely something that then gets shared prior to submission.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Mary Vance is sitting here with us and says thank you for speaking up.
Hi, Mary.
Peg. All right. Is there anyone who'd like to add anything to what Peg has said before we move on? If so, feel free to raise your hand by hitting the raise your hand feature on the attendee list. All right, I'm going to move on, but if anybody does think of something they want to talk about, feel free. All right, so just to wrap this particular section up, the logic model informs lots of different elements of implementation planning, and it's an important tool for helping your program staff understand the theoretical framework of the intervention, which risk and protective factors are being targeted, and how all of that's going to lead to the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve. All right, so the next phase that we want to talk about is mid-course corrections. A common mid-course correction strategy is continuous quality improvement, and our team released a tip sheet recently on CQI, and it's on the community practice website that Lori mentioned before. So if your grant's primary contact has granted you access or permission, you can get more information about CQI on the Community Practice website in the Training Resources section. So for those of you who may not be familiar with CQI, CQI is a systematic approach that uses information that you get through program monitoring and evaluation in a feedback loop to make improvements throughout your project. And you can see in this graphic at the top, the first question is, well, what do we do? And then as you roll clockwise, you assess, did this work? What changes should we make to improve our project? What is our plan to modify as we need? Let's document what happened, and then we go back up to the beginning. So what did we accomplish at this point? And we keep going around the circle to assess in this continuous feedback loop. Here are some questions that you may ask through the CQI process that link back to your logic model, and I just want to highlight a few of them. On the left-hand column, inputs and resources, the middle question, are you fully staffed? This is an issue that we see quite a bit when we're working with not only prep and absence grantees, but with lots of different folks, that you may have the best of intentions and a great hiring plan, and something didn't happen, and you don't have all of the key individuals that you need. And so that's one of the things that your logic model will point you to. What is your staffing supposed to look like, and will help remind you to compare where you are right now versus where you thought that you would be, and to take that into account as you move through the logic model, that might account for some of the things that you're seeing happening and unfolding. The second column on activities, the middle box, do you need to make cultural adaptations to your activities? This is something that we see quite a bit with both evidence-based curricula that prep grantees are using and other curricula that may be evidence-informed or promising that absence grantees may be using. That regardless of the curriculum or how much evidence there is around it, it may need to be adapted culturally to meet the needs of the community that's being targeted. And so those types of adaptations may be something that need to be documented in your logic model, that this is actually one of the activities that you're going to engage in to make your program very relevant for the folks that you're delivering to. The third column on outputs at the bottom, one of the questions that you may want to think about, are youth receiving an appropriate dosage of your intervention activities? It may be that what you intended to deliver may not be what kids are staying in their seats to receive all the time, or there may be enough migration that's going on in your school system or in your community that kids are not able to be there for the entire course of your intervention. And it may be that you intended to deliver a certain amount of dosage. You may be meeting that and getting some feedback from youth that they actually need a different level of dosage. They may be overdosed and feel like they are getting more than they need, or more of the things that they don't feel that they need and not enough of what they do need. Or they may just not be getting enough, and there may be additional activities that you want to add as a booster or to supplement what you were planning to do originally. Under outcomes, the last question, do your data suggest benefit from your project so far? It's always exciting when you get mid-course evaluation data, or even customer satisfaction data, or some type of fidelity monitoring data that are encouraging and show you that you're on the right track. And your logic model, again, is a place to look back at what are the outcomes that you were hoping to target, and when you are looking at your mid-course information, using CQI, you can see where are you in terms of where you thought you wanted to be at this point. One of the CQI questions I just mentioned on the previous slide about activities was about adaptation, but it's very important to be clear on the difference between program adaptation and program drift. Program adaptation is usually approached cautiously to allow a curriculum to be delivered faithfully in situations where otherwise might not fit. And so we talk, for instance, about cultural adaptations, and I also mentioned possibly adding approved materials or activities or language. You know, sometimes the scenarios or role plays that are written may use names or situations or language that just doesn't jive with the kids that you're working with, and small adaptations like that may be perfectly appropriate. And I know that prep grantees have received guidance from FISB about adaptations and seeking approvals for some types of adaptations. But on the other hand, program drift is a misapplication or a mistaken application of the model, and this usually involves technical error or abandonment of core components, or introduction of some elements that actually may be harmful or counterproductive. And usually drift does not benefit participants in the way that program adaptation is usually geared towards benefiting participants and making things more amenable to them and where they're coming from. I don't think FISBE has sent a memo about program drift because you probably won't get approvals for program drift. So the important thing is to be alert for potential program drift so that you can avoid it. And what a surprise, the logic model can help you assess program drift. So that's one of the reasons that we brought this up. On our projects, we refer to it regularly to compare what's happening to what's intended. Your logic model can inform your fidelity monitoring tools because you're listing right there your activities, strategies, and outputs that you're looking for. So your fidelity monitoring tools should reflect what you put in your logic model under those categories. And also can ensure that the risk and protective factors that are identified in your logic model are addressed. The logic model can also help you identify errors or omission of core components or additions that may be counterproductive. It can help you reset your course by revisiting it, and it can help you provide feedback to your team when you learn what happened and why, and then you can use the logic model, as we've mentioned, for retraining your staff, because remember how succinctly it helps your staff to get the big picture again, and also for continued monitoring and providing support and guidance. It's a tool that we've used several times when we've sat down with staff, not just for retraining, but for trying to talk about what's happening here, what are your thought processes, and how are those mapping up with what we intended. All right, so we've talked about readjusting your project activities and approach to match your logic model, but there may be two circumstances when you want to consider revising your logic model instead of revising your activities to match the original logic model. The first may be that you are just doing more activities, or you have more specific information to clarify and document in your logic model. So it may be that you're just outdoing yourselves, you're delivering program like crazy, you've added some really innovative, nice ideas, and they all complement your original idea, and you're trying to make sure that your logic model is as awesome as your program delivery and is complete, and you're capturing all of that information. The second situation is that you may decide that you actually want to change your intervention. We've talked with grantees who have found that the curriculum that they've selected is not working for their community, or that there is something about their approach, the adulthood prep subjects, that they might be choosing for prep grantees, or other types of approaches, it turns out are not going to work out the way that they thought. And if that's the case, indeed, your logic model should match your intervention delivery, but what we've put on the slide is it's very important to discuss with your project officer if you're thinking about making changes to your intervention approach. So we always advocate that your logic model and your intervention match each other, but if you're going to make a change like this that's different from what you put in your grant application, important to talk with the project officer and get approval for that before you start revising your logic model to match it. All right, so I'll pause here and see if there are any comments or questions that folks want to ask, probably by raising your hand. It looks like all of the presenters and speakers, folks at FISBE are able to use chat, so that's great. Any folks there have anything to say? But in terms of grantee participants, I think we're going to have to do raise your hand. And it's perfectly okay if you don't have a question or comment, but we just thought we'd offer an opportunity here if folks wanted to say or ask something before we move on. All right, we'll keep our eyes peeled to see if there are any questions or comments that come up. And we'll move into case study. So we provided a Word document handout as part of the materials that came out with this webinar on Friday. If you did not receive these materials, it's okay. They will all be posted on the community practice website. And if your primary contact has granted you access, you can pull them all down there. For those who do have it, it's just a paragraph. And if you don't, I'll just go ahead and read it. It's very simple. So we are talking here about Roberts County Pregnancy Prevention Coalition. And this coalition has plans to implement the Becoming a Responsible Teen BART curriculum with youth. They're recruiting youth aged 14 to 15 from schools, churches, and clubs to participate in the curriculum, which will be implemented at a local church. After several weeks, they recruited a large amount of youth, all of whom can only come for 2 Saturdays. The youth have been recruited from local high schools, and they're actually aged 14 to 17. So not wanting to turn anybody away, they decide to implement the curriculum in 2 batch sessions and modify the curriculum to implement the lessons with large groups instead of small groups to accommodate the large number of young people. Because the youth they recruited are older and in high school, the coalition also decides to add activities on financial literacy and educational and career success. All right, so that's the situation. And this is the original project model for the Roberts County Pregnancy Prevention Coalition. You can see on the left-hand side in inputs, they were going to train their facilitators in BART and use the BART curriculum and get some community locations to agree to recruit youth. They're going to recruit youth aged 14 to 15, get some space, and definitely get their funding from FSBE to move forward. Under activities, they were going to do small groups with 8 sessions for each intervention, about an hour and a half or 2 hours each. They're going to distribute some adolescent development educational materials to youth and bring in a healthy relationships guest speaker. And their outputs are going to be the number of youth served and the number of hours of education that students receive. And then you can see on the right the outcomes they were going to achieve and their overall goal. All right, so after reading or hearing about the case study, we're wondering what you would recommend happen next. So we're wondering if folks can raise their hand and give some advice for the Roberts County Pregnancy Prevention Coalition. They have their original logic model, and then they have what they decided to move forward on. And it looks like Peg wants to talk again, and so Jamie, can you open the line for Peg?
Hey, Peg, you're on.
Hello. Hi, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the... Hello. Just tell me if you need me to stay mute. Yeah, it seems like the first thing is seeing whether or not BART, the developers, would recommend that it be used up to age 17, and also whether or not the large group setting is still going to maintain fidelity, or is that going to compromise it in some way. Yeah, and then I guess with the prep grant, also ensuring that then if they're adding in financial literacy and education and career success, then that becomes a component that is provided to everybody participating, whether or not they're primarily those older teens or they're, you know, the 14-year-olds.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I really like that you're suggesting check with the developer to make sure this is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate, and also check on whether large group is really going to work beyond small group for the types of activities that BART is offering up. And let's say that the developer says some part of that is okay. What we're hoping is that there will be some revisions to the logic model so that they don't have an outdated logic model that looks like what you have on your screen, and yet they have program delivery that looks more like what we've discussed.
Right.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peg.
Mm-hmm.
Any other ideas from folks about what this coalition should do? It looks like Thelma Moten wants to talk as well. Thelma, I think you're
Hi. Can you hear me? Hi. I'm looking at the possibility of having larger groups versus the proposed small group sessions. And doing the larger group sessions, it might be a possibility under the activity after you have your healthy relationship guest speaker, or even a lesson from the BART curricula, is at that time to put them into small groups with a volunteer facilitator at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know
I
if
think
that would...
it's a great idea. Just because 1 million kids can come on Saturday and you have a whole bunch of kids, there may still be an opportunity to break them into small groups if you can bring in some facilitators to do that.
Yeah.
Excellent. And I'm hoping that the coalition will revise their logic model once they figure out what they're going to do about all that. Great. Thank you so much, Thelma. Any other comments or ideas about what the Roberts County Coalition might want to do here? All right, I think Peg and Thelma hit just about everything that we had brainstormed and more. We did want to point out that another thing that this coalition probably is going to need to do is to touch base with their project officer to make sure that the adaptations that they're thinking about are going to be okay with FSBE, looking at that adaptation guidance in terms of whether they need to get approvals or just need to notify their project officer. And also they may want to think about how the different activities that they are doing, for instance, financial literacy and educational and career success, might affect some of the risk and protective factors and how those might lead to some of the different outcomes. I can imagine if you look in the outcomes box that financial literacy and educational and career success might feed beautifully into increasing self-efficacy and increasing skills in assertive communication and negotiation. These may or may not be about assertive communication and negotiation about sexual activity per se, but certainly it may build these kids' skills about general communication and assertiveness, which could feed into and then build on skills about refusal and other types of negotiation. And I can imagine also that financial literacy and educational and career success might lead to other constructs that are linked to the goals, such as future orientation. So those may be other things that the coalition thinks that they may be targeting. They may want to put that in their logic model. And then, foreshadowing where we're going in just a minute, they may want to think about that for their evaluation as well. All right, so just to summarize this part, the logic model can facilitate implementation of continuous quality improvement within the project and certainly can help assess intervention drift. And when the logic model may need to be revised, it's important to talk with your project officer if the reason you're revising it is that you're considering making changes to your intervention. And it's always important to compare what's happening over time to the logic model and keep your logic model updated to facilitate a common understanding among everyone who's involved in your project. So I'll turn it back over to Laura to talk about evaluation.
Hi again, everyone. One of my roles is a project evaluator, so this section makes me happy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about using your logic model as a tool for your local evaluation. First off, it's really important that your local evaluator, if you have one, gets a copy of your logic model so they can see all of your project activities, how they fit together, what risk and protective factors and outcomes you're targeting, and also what theory is guiding all of those for your project. The logic model shows a few important inputs and outputs for your project. So it's going to show what data the project staff are going to provide for the evaluation, and that what sorts of findings or reports or outcomes are going to come out of that evaluation. If your logic model changes, it's really important to keep your project or your local evaluator updated on that. So if the format of how you're delivering intervention changes, or if the specifics of what you're delivering change, really important that you know that. So in our BART example, really important for your evaluator to know how many kids are being targeted and what exactly are they receiving. So just important that they have the most current information possible. This all feeds into your evaluation design, your sampling strategy, the measures that you use, the kinds of data that you collect, what types of analyses you run, and the timeline on which all of this happens. And again, your logic model is really a roadmap. Every box in your logic model is somehow going to feed into evaluation activities. It can tell you what evaluation questions you should be asking, and given your resources and other input, what can you reasonably expect to answer with your evaluation, and what can you reasonably expect to see happen. It can also inform things like evaluation design. So is it important, for example, to have a control group as part of your evaluation, and who might an appropriate control group be? Also, it feeds into not only outcome evaluation or figuring out how behavior changed among your target population, but also implementation evaluation. So did all of the proper inputs and outputs and resources all happen for your project? Also, your logic model can inform the timeline for all of your evaluation activities. So again, your logic model depicts a pathway. A has to happen before B happens before C. So you're going to be able to get information on your inputs and your outputs and your activities, or implementation evaluation information. Then the next thing you'll get is your short-term outcomes, or information on how your risk and protective factors may have changed. And then finally, your long-term outcomes will be the next thing that your evaluator will be able to report on. So it's unreasonable to expect, let's say, getting outcome evaluation results on your long-term outcomes before you're able to see the earlier steps in your project evaluated. Also, your logic model is going to show what's appropriate and practical for measurement when it comes to your logic model. So for example, when are kids already being seen for programming or activities, and maybe you can add evaluation into the sessions where kids are getting programmed. How many kids are you planning to target, and that influences what the evaluator needs to do, or what kinds of analyses they're able to run. How are your kids spread across units? So for example, are your kids all in one school? Are they in 20 different schools? So that again informs a lot of evaluation decisions. And also what resources are valuable for evaluation. You know, we can do evaluation, you know, in some ways cheap and quick, or sometimes we can do a more in-depth evaluation, or more complex evaluation if there are more resources. So it's helpful to know what resources are on the table. Also, your logic model is going to inform your analytic approach. So you're going to pick analyses that are able to answer your stakeholder questions. Again, that ties back to what we talked about at the beginning of today's webinar. So you want to pick analyses that can talk about why your project worked, did it work, why did it work, and what can you transfer into new endeavors moving forward. Okay, so we have one more interactive discussion activity today. So this is a project logic model. So we'd like for you to take a look at this logic model, and then raise your hand and let us know if you can come up with some evaluation questions that you or your stakeholders, you can imagine, might want to hear based on this logic model. What sorts of things do you think stakeholders might want to hear about this particular project? So it looks like this activity, a grantee is partnering with sub-awardees, and they're going to recruit youth, and it looks like they're going to be doing an abstinence education curriculum. And then they're going to be hoping to change parent-child communication and parent involvement, involvement in positive activities, future beliefs, educational success, self-efficacy to remain abstinent, attitudes about sexual risk, and healthy life skills. And their hope is that ultimately that will increase parent-child communication, improve abstinence attitudes, decrease the rates of sexual behavior, and decrease intentions to have sex. And they're also expecting that these results will be moderated by a few things. So pre-program risk levels. So maybe this project expects that their program will be most effective for kids who are low risk at the beginning, and it'll be tougher to change the behavior of high-risk kids. And also looking at demographic characteristics. This project may feel like, for example, the program may be more effective for girls versus boys, or for kids in two-parent homes versus single-parent homes. So what sorts of questions do you think you might want to see an evaluation answer based on this project? It looks like Thelma. Okay, Thelma, go ahead, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think one of the things I'd like to see would be the proposed number of participants that you plan to target, and the proposed number of what would the dosage look like.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point that and we've talked about earlier on. Those sort of inputs or outputs can be in your logic model, and that's you know, a great source of evaluation information. So it's a great point that it would be nice to get some specificity in here to see how many kids are being targeted and what does that look like. And that will help your evaluator plan data collection and analysis activities. That's a great point. Thanks, Velma. So does anyone else have any thoughts about what sorts of questions you'd like to have the answer to, and what do you think stakeholders would want to know about this project when it's all over? Or someone who put resources into this project, how do you think, what would they want to know about to know that they made a good investment in your project? It looks like Thelma, again, would like to ask. Okay, go ahead, Thelma.
Well, I'm just thinking your benchmark. I mean, where are you starting, and what kind of activity is taking place prior to the intervention? Where is the intervention taking place? Is it outside of a control? Is it like after school or during school? Is it a weekend? Those kinds of things.
Okay, great. So that's something else that could be added to the logic model is what sort of setting or what's the context for this intervention, and that's something great that feeds into sustainability. I think if you want to, if you have great outcomes of your project, what does someone need to have in place to have their best chance of getting outcomes like what you saw with your project? That's a great point. Thank you.
Laura, I just wanted to add one that I've been hearing from several different folks, and that is information about cost effectiveness. And it sort of combines the front end and the back end of the logic model. So as you were mentioning, resources that are going into the activities, and maybe some outputs about dosage, hours spent, number of kids served, and then your outcomes, how much did it cost to affect behavior change or changes in intention. And it seems like that sort of covers lots of different places on the logic model. I've had a lot of interest in those types of questions in this economic climate.
Great. Yep. No, that sounds great. Yeah, I agree. I think building off what Olivia says too, and the idea of these being tough economic times, and looking at this sort of nebulous moderator box at the top of the logic model. So I think I would be interested in hearing about if there are differential effects. Who are those differential effects for? So is it that it's effective for one gen or the other, or one age group but not the other, kids with a particular risk level or another? That may suggest that the kids who the project is effective for, that those would be good targets for the intervention later, and that maybe the kids where it wasn't as effective or wasn't effective at all, or maybe even harmful, that maybe those kids need to be targeted with something else if it's possible to break out kids into subgroups for implementation. That's not always possible, but let's say if it's older kids versus younger kids, and maybe your project shows, hey, this is really successful with kids where sexual behavior is becoming more normative, but it's not as successful with kids where sex is still a long way in the future. So maybe you continue to implement this with older kids, but you go ahead and find something that's going to be more effective for your younger population. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to share about what they'd like to know about this project? Oh, see that Peg. Okay, go ahead, Peg.
Hi. Okay, so two things. One is that it mentions partnering with subawardees, so I would want to know who is that and what are they bringing to the table in terms of experience in this area. And then the other thing is just, again, if I'm thinking from being sort of an outside stakeholder who's not directly involved with the project, I may not know what compliance with A through H criteria means, so I'd probably need an explanation around that as well, or any acronyms that kind of get thrown into logic models, just making sure that we explain those to people well.
Got it. I think that's a really great point, and that builds into wanting your logic model to be a good communication tool. So making it as clear as possible so that it is really a standalone document that folks aren't having to flip to other resources or guess at what that means. I think that's an excellent point. And also your point about subawardees is really great. Subawardees can look really different in terms of what their expertise is, what their background is, what sorts of resources they're bringing to the table. And again, if you want to replicate your project later or evaluate, if your project did or didn't work the way you thought it did, figuring out, what does that mean? What did those subawardees bring in? It's helpful to know specifically what they were bringing to the table. So great point. Thank you, Peg.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have anything they would like to add? Great. Well, thanks for all the great discussion on those points. So I'll go ahead and just take a minute to wrap up everything that we've talked about here today from front to back. So first of all, we think it's a great idea to revisit your logic model throughout implementation and evaluation. It has a lot of benefits to sites, and as you can see, it can help you answer a lot of tough questions. It's important to explain the benefits of revisiting your logic model to everyone in your project team. Your logic model, again, can be used at lots of different stages. So project planning, implementation startup, and for making mid-course corrections. Also, your logic model is a communication tool that could be used with your local evaluator, and that can help the whole evaluation team make good decisions about evaluation and how to plan for that. And finally, if there's anything that we've talked about today that you want to move forward and do at your site that you feel like you need help with, please request technical assistance through your project officer, and we would be happy to work with you to talk about your project logic model and how that ties into implementation and or evaluation. So thank you for your time today. Are there any other questions or comments or anything else folks would like to share? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and we hope that you have a good afternoon.